Special thanks to Angela Ang for putting that wonderful theme together. Angela Ang, of course, audio and video extraordinaire, retired NYPD officer, co-host of the Allegedly Guilty podcast. Although it feels like a Barry White soundtrack, I was waiting for his vocals to come in at one point. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to what is the first Mike the New Haven podcast episode for the year 2022. I thank you immensely for your support throughout 2021. All the episodes we did, all the guests we were able to bring on, just incredible. So if you haven't checked it out yet, go check out the best of the Mike the New Haven podcast. I put together an end of year best of, highlighting all the great moments that we had throughout the year, and hopefully many more to come. So for our first show of 2022, we welcome my next guest, who was a frequent face on American television, still is, for over 40 years now, almost 50. A 1971 graduate of the University of Iowa, he'd waste no time in finding his way to the national stage, signing on as a national correspondent with NBC News initially in 1974. Spending 20 years with the Peacock Network, he joined ABC in 1994, where for the next near quarter century, he reported on matters ranging from terrorism, nuclear smuggling, and political misconduct. Currently a host on the Law and Crime Network, his program, Brian Ross Investigates, has aired since 2018, and that is, of course, Mr. Brian Ross, who joins me now on the Mike the New Haven podcast for the first show of 2022. Brian, welcome. How are you?
It's great to be here, Mike. Happy New Year to you.
Thank you very much. So, the first question: grew up in Chicago. Take me through it.
I grew up in suburban Chicago, and I was fortunate enough that when I was in a high school, somebody opened a small radio station in my town. And so I became very interested in broadcasting, worked at the radio station. I was the editor of the high school newspaper. And somehow a small TV station in Chicago opened up. They decided to do a story about high school, or a weekly show really, on Chicagoland prep sports, high school sports. And they figured to be cheap, you could get the films from the coaches. And they had a serious anchor person. They said, we should have a high school kid come in and be part of the anchor team. That was me. So I started in TV at age 15 or so in Chicago, and I've had the bug ever since.
I was going to say, you always get bit by the bug really early, and once you get in it, there's no bringing it back out.
Right.
So it's interesting. It's interesting, and it's a great start, because you have room for error, you have room to improve, and you're just so eager at that age that people take a shine to you.
Absolutely. You make your mistakes when you don't think anybody's watching, although someone's watching.
Yeah, someone's watching. So the University of Iowa, I mean, you come from a big city in Chicago. Even if you grew up in the suburbs, going into the city itself was never too far away. The makeup of the University of Iowa at the time, it's more rural, as we think about it. Was it a bit of a culture shock for you, or not at all?
A bit, but Iowa City, where the University of Iowa is, where I graduated, because I had been at two other schools in Iowa before that, is a rather cosmopolitan compared to the rest of Iowa. Very democratic place. And when I was in school there, I was the stringer for the local NBC TV station. And it was a time of great turbulence on campuses in 1970 and 71, after Kent State and the bombing of Cambodia, and all the Vietnam era protests were going on. And there was a lot of news to be covered in Iowa City. So I was very busy being the stringer. I probably spent more time being a reporter than I was a student, but I got through it.
And then Brian Ross is our guest here in the Mike the New Haven podcast. This is the first show of 2022, and we're certainly happy to have him. So it's an interesting time to cut your teeth, because and I had this conversation with Jeff Greenfield, Is it the tension of the mid 1960s? Not necessarily, but the residue is still being felt. And around this time, obviously in the 70s, we have Nixon in office and we have the controversy of Watergate that would soon follow. And the thing about national stories is that there's a trickle down effect. It affects every single part of the country, some more than others. As far as, and you kind of touched on it just now, but I'll ask you nonetheless to expand on it. As far as the national climate at the time and the controversies that we had going on at the national level, particularly in Washington, what was the trickle down effect like for you in Iowa?
Well, in Iowa City, you'd have a sense that on campus, staunchly opposed to the war in Vietnam. It was a time when students in college were no longer deferred from the draft. And I can recall when the numbers had a lottery and you got your lottery number based on your birth date. And that lottery number would tell you whether you're going to be drafted and go to Vietnam or not. And I recall I was working the weekends at the local TV station, and the old UPI ticker tape was coming across, and I could see the dates coming, and mine was 201, and that was the year that the draft went up to 200. So I missed it by one number.
Wow.
Otherwise, I probably would have been drafted and off to Vietnam.
Wow. Oh my goodness.
So yes, there's a trickle down effect. All of that affects everybody. I had friends who said, we're going to Canada. I had friends who said, I'm never going to go, and friends who gladly signed up.
At that stage, being as young as you were, really in the eye of the storm, an issue for a reporter, well, not an issue, but sometimes a challenge, that's a better way to put it, can be the aspect of neutrality. We're all human. We all have our respective opinions, and maybe they're shared in private with our confidants. But that being said, for you have to get both sides of the story. And given the fact that you were nearly, as you just finished saying, sent off, you missed it by one, or you would have at the very minimum faced a tough decision. How hard was it for you, if at all, to maintain that objectivity?
Well, I can certainly empathize and understand the angst for parents who lost sons who went to Vietnam or were afraid that their sons would in fact go and never come home. So I can understand that. And I recall in our newsroom at the TV station in Waterloo, Iowa, where I worked, great anger on the part of the sales staff and the older men who had no risk of going to Vietnam, being furious that we were covering these protests. Why are you doing that? Essentially just short of accusing me of being a communist. And I said, well, in this country, everybody has a right to complain and protest, don't they? Well, barely. But anyway, it was tough, and you can sort of see, I don't know, I didn't see their point of view, but I did understand that there was a different point of view.
Brian Ross is our guest here in the Mike Tinaven podcast. We're happy to have him. Quick shout out to the friends in the live chat. Margaret Hearn is here, Alicia B. and Scott Wagner, retired NYPD detective who will be on the show again, hopefully soon. Stay on the lookout for that interview when it drops. So you spent some time in Miami and Cleveland. Miami, not Miami of Ohio, but rather Miami of Florida, of course, and Cleveland, Ohio, which we'll touch on especially in a moment. Two larger cities. Miami at this time in the 70s and 80s is the cocaine cowboys era. So on Miami first, I imagine it had to be a pretty easy sell going from Iowa to Miami.
Right. And I'll tell you, in between Iowa and Miami, I ended up getting fired from my first job in Waterloo. After graduation, I was all set, $120 a week, full-time at the TV station. And I was the weekend editor and assignment editor and anchor as well. I do the weather sometimes or the sports, whatever was going on. And there was to be a big protest in Waterloo about a new interstate highway that was going to help make possible a new John Deere tractor factory. Lots of jobs, lots of economic growth. Everyone was for it except for the people under whose home Highway 218 was going to go. And they had a big protest, and we got instructions from our owners not to cover the protest. Well, I was a graduate of Iowa. I knew about journalism. I said, we're going to cover it. So we did cover it on a Saturday. And as you know, in a small TV station, you can do almost anything you want. No one's around. But on Monday, I got sacked. I was fired. And fortunately, my previous boss there, who had moved on, had become the press secretary for the governor of Wisconsin. And I was hired to be the governor's speechwriter. I went off to Madison, and I worked there for a few months. There was no job I ever hated more because I knew all these secrets and I was still a reporter at heart. It was very hard to contain what I knew. And I thought to myself, if I stay in government, I'll become like the world's worst leaker. I'll be telling reporters everything. So I started looking for a job, and I got hired in Miami. And at that time in Miami, they paid you essentially with what they used to say, sand in your shoes. The salary wasn't much better than when I was making Waterloo. But when I got to Miami, it was a great time to be a reporter. Meyer Lansky, the organized crime boss, had just come back running around the world. The Watergate burglars all lived there. President Nixon had his weekend and kind of winter retreat in Key Biscayne. There was corruption in the courts, corruption in the government. It was a great time to be a reporter. So I loved Miami, and I was there for 2.5 years, began winning awards for investigative reporting. And I worked with some great people at the time. Fred Francis, who went on to NBC News, where I worked, and Clarence Jones, just a great crew of people. We were all competing against each other, investigative reporters. And it was a real golden era for TV news, at least from my point of view, in Miami.
Absolutely, because it's a time in which organized crime, as you kind of touched on, had a very firm grip, because there's also the Trafficante crime family. And Santo
Absolutely.
Trafficante was the Don back then, and he was somebody that had a stranglehold on everything, and he was somebody that was rumored to be implicated in the Kennedy assassination, allegedly made a deathbed confession. How valid that is, we don't know,
Yeah.
but nonetheless, made one. And I'll tell you, back then, at that stage in the game, was it easy to build sources? Because think about it, when you have honest people working in a corrupt environment, they're fed up and they're looking for a way to vent. Was that something that, for lack of a better way to ask the question, benefited you?
There were some who were trying to play it straight, but in general, you learn in these early jobs how to develop sources. And as you say, it's people who are fed up, who don't think the truth is getting out, feel it should get out. They are really decent Americans. They want the story told. And so that's how I began to learn how to develop sources, the late night meetings, the strange places, all led to pretty good stories that led to, for me, my first Peabody Award, my first DuPont Award came from down there.
We'll get to your Cleveland years momentarily, and particularly further coverage of organized crime. The Teamsters, very active, of course, during that era as well. But we'll spend a lot of time on the awards you won as well, not from an egotistical standpoint, but because recognition, there's an old saying about recognition, babies cry for it, men die for it. So that first award, I mean, I imagine the feeling never gets old, but that first award that you just alluded to, what is the feeling?
I didn't really understand. I didn't know what a Peabody Award was or a DuPont Award. I never really had heard of them. I know that I had a very, very tough whip cracking kind of news director there. And he understood that his job and his ability to get a big budget in the news department in Miami was based on these awards, because the owner of the station knew about those awards. So he worked hard. He was again and again determined to win major awards. And I was sort of the beneficiary of that. And, we investigated police corruption, all sorts of things. I'd still go to, when I'd land in Miami later as a network correspondent, there'd still be cops at the airport who remembered me as the guy whose story led them to be put on airport duty. So,
yeah, well, listen, hey, what are you going to do, right? You have a job to do, as exactly. A lot of the cops and firemen tell me when they're on, especially
you want to be liked or you want to be good. Yeah,
exactly. And there was, it reminds me of a line that Len Levitt told me, the late great police reporter who passed away almost 2 years ago now. It's hard to believe this man, it'll be 2 years that Lenny's been gone. And I asked him, what advice would you give, any young reporters out there? And he said to me in that classic raspy New York voice of his, your job isn't to be liked, it's to be honest. And he was right then, and he's still
absolutely.
right.
Couldn't agree more. Your loyalty should be to your readers, your listeners, your viewers.
Absolutely. By the way, to the people in the chat that are watching, I appreciate it. Some further shout outs. D Truth is here, loyal viewer. Peter Pranzo, retired NYPD Lieutenant, Ruth Ann Griffin, and his Peter's Pranzo's better half, Raquella. And for those of you in the chat that are watching, if you have a question that you'd like to ask Brian, please type it and I'll be sure to show it so that he can answer it. So that brings us to your time covering the Teamsters. I mean, again, I talked about it. Teamsters was ripe with corruption during this time. The mafia had a heavy influence nationwide. When we tend to think of the mafia, we tend to think of New York because movies like Goodfellas, and of course, there's other movies too, Mean Streets, they centered on the mob in New York. But in Cleveland, they pretty much owned that town. So you're in there and you're covering what's going on with the Teamsters. It's the world's worst kept secret of what's going on.
It
But
was.
nonetheless, you got to tread lightly because these people are people that are they going to kill you? No, it's bad for business to kill somebody that's high profile, but they can make your life difficult. So how do you tread that line of getting the truth out there, but watching your back and making sure you don't piss off the wrong people?
Well, you sort of want to piss off the wrong people in a way.
Yeah.
I was brought to Cleveland. My news director in Cleveland, Richard Lobo, great friend, great news director, went on to great fame within the NBC News station system.
Yes.
But he said, I want you to go after these Teamsters. They're trying to organize the Cleveland Police Department. And so I started looking into it, and I went to meet with the people at the federal government strike force in this little sort of down a lonely hall in the federal building. And a guy by the name of David Margolis, who went on to be great fame in the Justice Department in Washington, ran the strike force with some other attorneys who I got to know pretty well. And I said, what's the difference between the mafia and the Teamsters? He said, no, they're the same. They're the same. And so I began to focus on the Ohio Teamsters. And the reason for that was they had great power because Bill Presser, the old man Presser, and his son Jackie, they essentially controlled what's known as the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund. Sounds kind of boring, but Hoffa had put together a system where the truck companies contributed to the pensions of the truck drivers into a fund controlled by the union. Well, that fund became the source of income for all kinds of crazy schemes and ripoffs, and also built Las Vegas. And that was the money power center of the Teamsters Union. That's what it was really all about. And so I began to focus on the Teamsters and on Bill Presser and his young upcoming son, Jackie Presser. The more I did about him and exposed the corruption, the higher he went in the Teamsters and the higher I went in the network, quite honestly. At one point, he had a bit of a fling with someone, and his wife fled, called me from somewhere in the Florida Keys.
Oh, boy.
And said, Brian, you should know Jackie has been talking about putting a bomb under your car. I took that as a very real threat, as I should have. And, for months, I was looking under my little Toyota in the parking garage. And I went to the FBI and told them about this. And they said, don't worry about it. We'll take care of it. What I didn't know and would not learn for years later was that Jackie Presser was the FBI informant who essentially was using the FBI to rat out his rivals. And he rose to power, and he became the international president of the Teamsters Union. And there's no one he disliked more or sort of was afraid of more in ways than me, because I was always on his tail. And he knew kind of what I knew, or some of what I knew. And as he rose to power, I rose up in power at NBC, because after, you call Jimmy Hoffa, you've seen the movies.
Yes.
Once he disappeared, presumably murdered, kidnapped, the folks in the network in New York at NBC said, we've got to cover these Teamsters. Who knows about these Teamsters? He said, well, there's this kid, me, out in Cleveland. I was 26 years old. And he just won a DuPont Award for his story on the Ohio Teamsters. So I was loaned out for 2 weeks to go to the network, go to New York for my local reporting stint in Cleveland, and help them put together a story about the Teamsters. Well, that turned into a brand new career for me, because I linked up then with this terrific producer by the name of Ira Silverman, who knew exactly what to do. And I was really wet behind the ears. And my bosses at the time were Dick Wald, who'd become later the president of NBC News, then went to ABC, and Paul Friedman, who became the head guy at CBS News and was at ABC News as well. Les Crystal, who went on to run PBS. So lots of great people that I worked with there, as I was loaned out for a couple of weeks and never really essentially went back. And that launched my career at NBC News.
It's hard not to get starstruck when you're walking into something of great magnitude and significance. 30 Rock is a place like that
Yeah,
because it's not just news, it
you're
envelops
telling me, yeah,
entertainment.
exactly.
It envelops, think about the figures not even in news that have walked through those doors through the years for one reason or another. Walking in there the first time, was there an element, and I imagine there was, but still, I'll ask the question, was there an element of, wow, pinch me?
Totally. To go and meet David Brinkley and John Chancellor, who were then the anchors of the NBC nightly news. John Chancellor said to me, "How old are you? 14?" I guess I looked rather young. And Barbara Walters at that point was still at the Today program with Hugh Downs and all these icons I'd sort of grown up watching on TV in Chicago, on Channel 5 in Chicago. Suddenly, there I was working with them. I could not have been more nervous.
But I tell you, there's that element. I had this conversation with John Miller. You kind of feel like you're the bench player in the 1998 Yankees. There's all these legends in these lineups like Bernie Williams and Paul O'Neill
Yeah.
and Derek Jeter, but then you're Ricky Leday, the rookie coming into it. So for you, I mean, listen, there are people that maybe get a little bit of jealousy in the news business, and unfortunately, that's a part of life in every place, no matter where you work. But there's also the people that look at a young person trying to make something of themselves, and because it reminds them of themselves when they were at that point, they take you underneath their wing. Who were those people for you at NBC?
Certainly John Chancellor, certainly Ira Silverman, terrific producer, were like that. Others were rivals
Yeah.
who did not really want to see me succeed.
Mhm.
And I, at the time I was sort of like a new kind of reporter. I was not a general assignment person. I came in with a kind of an edge, and I didn't mind, in fact, wanted to cause trouble and controversy. I mean, I sought it. I went into the flames, and for better or worse, that's what I've always done. But I figured that's, I don't have this. I didn't have the greatest voice. I'm not the best looking guy, but at least I could be a good, solid journalist. And at that time in network news, they were very good reporters, but they were a day in, day out firemen, covered the news. If you could figure out how to do a minute 15, minute 30, that was really a great art. When I started my first report on nightly news, they created this notion of a 5-part series with pieces that would run 4 or 5 minutes, which was literally like documentary length at the time. And that was the first time that kind of thing went on the nightly newscast. It was great. It also drove off 2 or 3 other stories. So, not everybody thought it was such a great idea. I loved it. And I figured that's how I was going to thrive, by doing work that nobody else would do. You're crazy. They're going to blow you up. I mean, Linda Ellerby had the office next to mine. She said, I'm afraid they're going to plant a bomb next to us. What's going on? A lot of it was myth,
Right.
although there had been a bomb threat. But a lot of it, people sort of like loved the idea of this sort of young kid coming in, taking on the bad guys.
Linda Ellerby, there's a name I have not heard in a while, because for
Terrific
those of you
producer.
who are
Yeah.
younger that will watch and listen to this, if you grew up watching Nickelodeon like we did as kids, she did the Nick News. So that's where I know her from. Anytime I think of Linda, you just triggered like such happy childhood memories of watching her.
Great, great, great.
Love Linda Ellerby. That's always be a part of my childhood. So the 70s really through the mid 90s, when you pivoted over to ABC, which I'll get to in a second. I mean, so much happened. We had the hostage crisis in Iran, the end of it towards the Reagan administration. Of course, it's beginning during the Carter administration. Also, stories that had a great effect because they happened in your backyard in New York, the John Lennon assassination. Of course, we had the Reagan assassination, not in New York, but certainly something that was a major, major turning point in news coverage in the 80s. We had the continuation of.
Yeah, I was the first reporter on the scene for the murder of John Lennon.
Take me through that.
I had just met a source at the FBI, and was taking the bus home because I couldn't afford a taxi. Really, they didn't pay me that well. And my apartment was 2 blocks away from the Dakota on the Upper West Side of New York, where Lennon lived. And I got off the bus and saw across the street in front of the Dakota 2 or 3 police cars and an ambulance. And I sort of walked over, and they said, someone just shot John Lennon. And I ran across the street, and there were still payphones. Got on the payphone, and called the NBC news desk. And that was the first I'd heard of it. And I stayed on the phone. And I ended up being the person who announced on the interrupter of the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, John Lennon is dead. That was me. And it was just a coincidence. I found myself in the middle of so many different stories. I feel a little bit like what's that character that Tom Hanks played? You sort of end up I took that bus and ended up right there, and that's what I saw.
Forrest Gump.
Yeah, Forrest Gump.
That instance there. Here is somebody who was a part of not just Americana, but just he transcends that. John Lennon was an iconic figure worldwide, so beloved for his contributions to the Beatles, so beloved even after that, even with the controversial breakup of the Beatles. I imagine you were a fan of his. So
and it still gives me chills because it was a warm December night, and in my apartment I had the windows open. I got home like at 2 or 3, and all night into the morning I could hear crowds singing "Give Peace a Chance." All we were saying is "Give peace a chance," over and over and over and over, as thousands, tens of thousands gathered in front of the Dakota.
I never knew that. That's the first I hear of that you were the first. I never. Wow. And because everybody points to the Howard Cosell moment during Monday Night Football where he comes in on the ABC feed and announces that Mr. Lennon was dead, but I didn't know that on the NBC feed.
On the NBC feed. I don't know if it still exists. I've found myself in that situation. I ended up being called in on a Saturday night by the NBC News executives to be told that there's been a terrible accident down in Jonestown. An NBC crew was down there trying to investigate the Jim Jones cult. And they said, and I remember Les Christo was the president of NBC News saying, I just heard from the CIA, they have overhead shots and they can see a camera, someone dead next to a camera and another person dead. And we have 2 others, we don't know where they are. And so I went on Saturday Night Live with an interrupt to announce that what had happened in Jonestown. So, you never know, like in this business, as you know, you never know when you're going to be on, what's going to happen tonight, tomorrow, a week tonight.
When you're in those moments, you have to obviously announce this with a factual tinge because these are the facts of the situation,
right?
But they're brutal facts, and there is a delicate nature to the way one should do it. It's not easy to say John Lennon's dead or our colleagues at NBC have been executed, as you just alluded to. To compose yourself, to articulate this properly, given your attachment to these stories as A, a Lennon fan, and B, somebody who works for the same corporation in NBC. How does one do that without breaking down emotionally?
Tight focus. Keep your eyes on what you're going to. Don't mess it up. First of all, don't blow it. But just try to subsume all the emotion and just sort of here are the facts. Here's what we know, and don't get in the situation like we are now. I'm not going to tell stories and talk. It's fun to do, but at those moments you've got to be the ultimate consummate professional.
Absolutely. Brian Ross is our guest here in the Mike Dunhaven podcast. It's been a great conversation with him so far. And like I said, for those of you in the chat, if you want to ask Brian something, type away, and I promise I'll get to it, and Brian will be able to see it. So I want to touch on a few things as well that also happened during the 80s. We had the assassination, or attempted assassination, I should say, let me correct myself, of President Reagan. We were not too far removed from that point. It had been less than 20 years since President Kennedy's assassination in 1963, 13 years since the assassination of Martin Luther King as well as Bobby Kennedy. So this is still very fresh in Americans' minds. And now Reagan has been shot by John Hinckley and nearly killed. Covering that, knowing full well what had happened to President Kennedy, remembering that very well as a teenager, as you were when it happened, to have to cover Reagan's attempted murder. What was that like for you?
Well, I would say that I was in New York when it happened, not in Washington. So I was not part of the original reporting team. And, I'll tell you, with any big story, you can be guaranteed you're going to get something wrong, some fact wrong. And NBC got criticized for saying that Reagan had a heart attack, which wasn't true, and a variety of misinformation. And it was, as I watched that, I tried to learn, be careful, because the first draft of history is almost generally going to be wrong somehow, some way. But then I sort of got into who Hinckley was, what that was all about. And that was, fascinating to me to report on that. But I was not part of that instant news coverage on that day. I wanted to be, but I was no place for a New York reporter.
Oh, there you go. But in the backyard, nonetheless, of New York, we had the escalating conflict in the Middle East. And the reason that I bring that up is even though it wasn't happening in New York with the continuation of the Cold War and the conflict in Beirut, the bombing that killed numerous Marines, is that New York is the cultural crossroads of the world. Every kind of culture you will find in the 5 boroughs. And not only that, the premier offices for these federal agencies, the FBI, the CIA, the ATF, and so on and so forth, are based in New York. 26 Federal Plaza is hallowed ground, for lack of a better way to put it, just because of the history of it. So during this time in which tensions are rising and everybody's on high alert for that big attack, which never came, no nuclear warfare happened, thankfully, but nonetheless, it was a very real threat during this era. From the boots on the ground perspective, what were you hearing during that time, if you can share it?
Well, in the 80s, I think the focus, I focused a lot more on the threat from the Colombian cartels and Carlos Later, which, I was not part of the Washington kind of beat team. I didn't have a beat there. And, I can't tell you how much the beat reporters disliked investigative reporters who would mess up their sources and anger the PR people. And so there's always a little bit of tension there. But I found myself in the 80s. First, I came to NBC doing the Teamsters and then the mafia, and that kind of grew into other union corruption. And then the whole influx of drugs, cocaine from Colombia became my beat for many, many years. I've done in, Medellin, Cali, and Bogota quite a bit, trying to focus on that, and also spending time out in California with, all that had happened there in terms of how it sort of raced through this country. So that became my big beat. I was very, fascinated by all of that, and it changed America in a way. They couldn't stop it. Tidal wave of drugs that came in. And that was, fascinating to me. I remember reporting on this one little island in the Bahamas called Norman's Key. And this was sort of the transshipment point for Carlos Later, the big Colombian cartel transportation chief, who brought his drugs into that little island. Somehow he had approval from the Bahamian government. You'd fly over the island in a helicopter, which was dangerous enough. And you'd see like DC-3s that were ditched in the water. They didn't quite make the runway. And that became, a major point of investigative journalism for me.
My goodness. The AIDS crisis. Did you cover that at all, or not really?
Not really. It was, it was an important social crisis, but there were others who were doing it who were probably more on the medical beat than I was. So I did not cover that.
Okay. Figured I'd ask, given the fact that, so much.
No, absolutely.
Absolutely. Let me see here. More shout outs to the live chat. Of course, Scott Wagner, the Truth Peter Pranzo is here as well. Margaret Hearn. Thank you guys as always for your support. I appreciate it. The World Trade Center bombing of 1993. This is kind of towards the end of your time with NBC. Again, backyard story. And so much of it is really a source of a turning point now in how we look at terrorism in the United States, because it represented the shift over to radical Islamic terrorism. There was the domestic terrorism of the 70s and the 80s with the Weather Underground and the FALN and the Black Liberation Army. And now we have the team of Ramzi Youssef, El Said Nosser, and so on and so forth, the blind sheikh, Osama bin Laden, who ordered this attack. And I've talked a lot about it with my friends from the bomb squad. But for you, seeing this attack, and hearing about the names responsible, what was the process like at NBC of covering something that at the time, way before 2001, and the even more devastating follow-up attack, was the most shocking attack to happen on U.S. soil?
Right. And we tried to make sense of it. What was it really all about? In a way, it seemed almost like they were not competent. They were incompetent bombers. They were silly enough to go back and try to demand their deposit back from the rental company for the van they used. And so I think the initial thing was, it's not that big a threat because they don't know what they're doing. We don't have to worry about them. Others, though, were saying, oh, yes, we do. There's something coming here, and obviously there was.
Yeah, for those of you that want to hear about that case in particular, please go check out my interviews with the guys from the bomb squad, particularly Donald Sadawi, who discovered the VIN number that was used along with Joe Hanlon from the ATF.
And that broke the case. Yeah.
That broke the case, that helped bring those guys into justice. And that attack, it set the forefront for the war on terror, what it is now. And there were other incidents too throughout the 90s. I mean, I'm sure you remember the attempted bombing of the Atlantic Avenue subway in 1997 as well. Letter bombs to the United Nations. So that attack definitely set the template for the current era and the fight against terror, which even now with Mr. Bin Laden being gone, thankfully, for almost 11 years now, still rages on, just in a different iteration. So back to your career, 94, 20 years at NBC, a lot of great stories, a lot of notable moments for you. You go over to ABC. You're pretty well established by this point. It had been 2 decades. Why leave?
Why leave? Well, Roone Arledge. He had tried to recruit me 2 or 3 years earlier, and I almost went and then changed my mind. He was furious, thought it was, I had betrayed him, lied to him. I really hadn't. I just couldn't kind of pull the trigger. And then he came back around again. And I recall that people at ABC would say, you never can talk to Roone. I couldn't get him off the phone. He was on the phone to me round the clock. I said, I'm not going to be here. I'm going to go on vacation. I'm going over to Europe with my wife. And we go to Paris, and Pierre Salinger calls me. And he was the ABC guy. And he said, I have instructions to take you to the finest restaurant and buy the best wine and tell you why you would love it here at ABC. And so it was whining, dining, suggesting I could do more. Because when I was at NBC, I had just, for the most part, at Nightly News, Tom Brokaw and John Chancellor didn't want me to go to these various magazine primetime programs. I'd finally begun to work on a program called Dateline, and it just started there. And, it was all fun, but Roone promised, a bigger portfolio, a bigger stage. And I was back and forth, and I recall he said, we're going to have a final meeting. You're getting cold feet. I went to the Regency Hotel on Park Avenue in New York, and Roone's there. Dick Wald was there. Dick Wald had been the president of NBC News, and I was there. Paul Friedman is there. Paul Friedman had been my initial senior producer at NBC. Ed Fooey, who was the great producer at NBC, and they're all there. And then in walks Bob Iger with an envelope. He says, here's a pen. I have your contract. And I thought at the time I was not really getting that kind of love from NBC. They take you for granted. You're there for a long time. They figure you're not going to leave. And I left. And it wasn't really, people said, oh, it's about the money. And actually, in the end, NBC came in with an offer even higher than Roone had promised. And when I said no to that, it's funny, it really angered the NBC people. So it's not about the money. You don't like us. It was like, well, it was, I thought it'd be a great time in my career, and turned out to be just a complete mess of a negotiation. But I left.
And I don't understand that, not from your angle. You didn't do anything wrong. But when you're there, when you're in one spot for 20 years, I mean, it's kind of like Tom Brady, right? Nobody was really mad. I mean, the fans weren't mad at him, but management in New England kind of held it against him that he left. And I got it because, okay, I've done all I could do here. I've won a bunch of championships in your end. You've won a lot of awards. You covered a lot of great stories. I want a new challenge. It's been 20 years. Yeah. So I don't understand that anger.
One of the executives at NBC said, I guess in an effort to keep me from going, said, if you go to ABC, you're going to be on the B team. You're never going to be on the A team. You're not going to be the big stories. And for me, that was all I had to hear. Like, all right, we'll see about that. It was a challenge, And when you feel like the job you're doing, you could do with one hand tied behind your back. So I left.
I will ask before I dive deeper into your time at ABC. You mentioned Tom Brokaw, rather.
Brokaw, right.
What was it like working with him? You have a good story that sticks out about him?
Just a terrific guy, all around, a team player, very good for morale. He boosted everybody. He's the kind of anchor man you'd want to work for, because he understood what you were doing. He didn't get in your way. He was supportive in every way. At one point I was sued by Wayne Newton, a long trial in Las Vegas. We had alleged, as it turns out, that he had called this guy who was in the Gambino Mafia family. And we had a story about it. And he sued. And the trial was held in Las Vegas, 6 weeks. And the jury came back against us. We lost. We won on appeal, went to the Supreme Court, and we won. But we lost. It was like 4 days before Christmas. At the time, it was the largest libel verdict in American history. I mean, you can imagine how great I felt. And it happened on the night of the NBC News Christmas party. And it was relayed to me how Brokaw raised a glass to me and my producer, Ira Silverman. And I will always be grateful for his support through a very dark period for me.
Mr. Brokaw, if you happen to see this episode later on at any point, come on the show. Please come on the show. So for you, that segues into another great person you work with at ABC, Peter Jennings. I always like to ask anybody that was at ABC, what it was like working with him, because he brought so much elegance to that position, and even though he was originally a Canadian, he really was an American through and through that had an equal love for both Canada and this country. And it showed in the way that he anchored. And he was just a great storyteller and a master when it came to writing scripts and editing scripts too, as I heard from John Miller when he was on this show. So to be in the presence of him, pure greatness. What was he like behind the scenes?
He's like, as you say, elegant. He was like the picture perfect anchorman. I don't think he ever finished high school. He began like sort of doing a TV show in Canada. And it was the one thing he sort of like always felt a little insecure, which was strange because he was so good. And he was so, as you say, such a great writer. And he worked so hard at what he did. He wanted everything perfect. And, I've had battles with him over scripts. Everyone has that worked with him. But that's just, it makes it better. It made it better. He was a terrific guy and a funny guy too. When I went into Iraq right after the U.S. invasion, I was part of the first team of journalists that went in, was not part of the embeds with the military. So we're kind of on our own. And I was doing, it was a Good Friday night, and I was doing a live thing on World News, which probably about, I guess, 7 or 8 hours time difference. So it was 1:30, 2:30 in the morning, standing on top of the sort of the parking garage of the Sheraton with all these lights on. All 3 networks had their guys live. And I'm doing sort of the live tag to my piece. And from across the way in some high-rise building, a shot rang out, and the bullet hit right in front of my feet.
My God.
And, and of course, everybody got in trouble because I wasn't wearing a helmet or a vest. So that was the first thing. But it was, so the next Monday, I'm on again to be live, and I'm getting set, and they sort of talk back and forth as you're getting set. And Peter said, sniper in place. It was, I have to say, one of those TV moments that, it's nice to have had it come through it and not have anything happen. But I thought Peter's sense of humor was impeccable.
And his timing was too. His timing was amazing.
Yeah.
And he is missed. I tell you, he is missed. It's going to be 17 years this August that he's been gone. And I tell you, news.
We were all wearing wristbands. What would Peter do? Sort of like to try to get us through. When Disney bought ABC and ABC News, and the Disney people tried to call us all cast members, and he was furious about that. He wouldn't be called a cast member for anything. Because the network bosses at times they wanted, would you wear a blazer with a lapel? There are big badges at ABC News. How about an American flag? He fought all of that, and he was right.
He was right. Yeah, absolutely. And a true pioneer and a gentleman of this profession who, again, is sorely, sorely missed. And so I want to shift more into your focus on terrorism in a moment and that story involving nuclear smuggling. And we're talking with Brian Ross here in the Mike and Maven podcast. But there is an interesting point in that there was the very controversial election of Gore and Bush 2000, which prior to 2020 was the most controversial election perhaps ever.
Sure.
So with that Florida recount and with Gore refusing to concede and with this hanging, it only hung in the air for about a month or so, but it felt like longer than that. For you to be there in the eye of the storm covering that, because there is New York implications. I mean, by this point, Hillary Clinton was running for Senate. She had won in 2000. Gore had some ventures in New York, if I remember correctly. So it does have that backyard feel. To cover that, what were you looking for specifically in a time in which it's hard to find things?
Al Gore let it go. He did not try to claim it was fraud, it was rigged. He was an American patriot, and he let it go. And so, as you say, sort of that hangover ended pretty quickly. It was like, all right, we accept it. If the Democratic Party leader is going to say that, then that's it. And so, we began to focus really on what was going on with the Bush administration, and what and it was. I recall that summer was a crazy summer because a lot of the news was focused on shark attacks and on whether an intern had been murdered by a congressman in Washington. Some of the most sort of frivolous, pointless stories you could imagine up until September 10th of 2001.
So that brings us to that day, because what we had prior is, well, we had domestic terrorism in the form of the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. We also had the bombing of the Atlanta Olympics in 96. But I mentioned there was the pipe bomb plot in Brooklyn in 1997. There was a shooting with Middle Eastern implications at the Empire State Building also in 97. The letter bombs aforementioned at the UN in 97 as well came from Alexandria, Egypt. The bombing of the U.S. Embassy in 1998, the attack on the USS Cole, and then that day. Miller and Jennings covered it the day itself, but the aftermath of it. You've been in New York a while. I don't know if you knew anybody that was killed in this attack, but as a New Yorker, as an American, as a human, to have to cover that, but also not just cover it from the emotional standpoint, but figure out what everyone wants to know: who did this and why.
Right.
What was that like?
Well, I was also on the desk there with John and Peter, and John said Al Qaeda. No doubts about it. Peter, frankly, wasn't so sure. Had to be convinced, because I recall in the Oklahoma City bombing, when many were saying this was a attack by people in the Mideast, and I recall Peter being skeptical then. And then I think we did the first reporting that it wasn't the Mideast, it was the Midwest. It was Michigan militia and Timothy McVeigh. So early on, Peter was open, but wondered if again the Mideast is getting a bad rap. We soon found out that wasn't the case, and I began to focus on who were these people, and right away this guy Muhammad Atta showed up on our radar screen as a leader of that group, and he was in fact the leader, and he was they began to search for him, and John had far better contacts than I did, NYPD and FBI, and it was we set up a kind of a command post, our own little war room off the main studio. And they called it the Crazy Eddie room because it had, they had all these screens and monitors. It looked like a crazy editor window shot, all the TVs for sale. And we probably had 15, 20 people in there working really around the clock. ABC did not go back to regular programming, maybe for a week. It was such a unprecedented attack on the country. Nobody could really get their arms wrapped around it very well.
And I think what was disconcerting at that time, or concerning rather, not disconcerting, is that, again, there were other things that were happening abroad that tied into his interview with bin Laden in 1998. Because if you recall, there were two bombings in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, particularly the 96 Khobar Towers bombing that killed 19 soldiers. During the Battle of Mogadishu, helicopters were shot down in Somalia that killed, I believe, 26 soldiers in that particular conflict. So this was a buildup. And bin Laden said something to John that still sends chills down my spine all these years later, even though he's been gone for quite some time. And that is, we do not differentiate, if you remember him saying this, between those who wear a military uniform and civilians. Civilians are our targets in these fatwas, which for those of you that don't know, Muslim means religious decree as well. And they were on that day.
Without a doubt. There was not a military attack on the World Trade Center. Maybe you could argue the Pentagon or the White House, but certainly not the World Trade Center. I had a very close friend who was there, and his wife called my wife and said, I think we've lost Tom, because he was in the building. And he showed up at our studios covered in this white dust. He had just made it out because he had been in the 93 attack. He'd been in the building. And when it happened this time, they were saying, stay where you are, don't worry. And he left. He wouldn't stay. He survived only because he had survived 93 and wasn't going to go through it again. He got out of the building before it collapsed. So we had him on the air, and then we began to unwind who were these people. And really, whatever I knew, a lot of it came from the excellent work of John Miller and Chris Isham, who I think really, led the way in knowing what was going on.
When it comes to gathering sources, which by this point was pivotal, you had been gathering sources forever. So when this happened, you knew what to do, and it helped get the information out there quickly. Even if as you said, your contacts weren't as good as other people, still you had contacts, and that's the point of it. And I asked this more from the standpoint of me personally. That's the one thing I'm really trying to learn how to do, is get sources so I can get some information out there. And listen, who doesn't want scoops? It's cool to be the first to be on a scoop. You want to make sure you get it right. Getting it right is more important than being first, which some people need to learn these days without naming names. But what's the key? If you had to say, what is the key to getting a good source?
Well, you don't get a good source after a 9/11 attack. If you don't have a source, then you're not going to get one. Everyone's too busy.
Right.
It is sort of learning to meet people on a story and then following up, staying in touch, call every few weeks, every month, when it's non-prime time, when nothing else is going on, just to say hi, let's have a dinner, let's have a coffee. And that's how you develop. It's really developing personal relationships that when you need someone, so you have their cell phone or their phone number, their direct line, and you can reach them when you need to, because others, if you're starting on that day, it's not the day to develop sources.
No, not at all. My friend Scott Wagner, of course, retired NYPD detective, says, for those that don't know, Crazy Eddie was a huge electronics store in New York City. If you remember,
Right.
For those of you who were older, at the end of his commercials, he would always say insane. And I don't believe that he's around anymore. So he's missed, a fixture of the past, and a funny one at that. Margaret Hearn has a question. And she says, Brian, what are some of the reasons you have found for the people to come forward as sources? You kind of touched on it earlier, but to answer a question, what would you say?
There are a variety of reasons. Sometimes they feel like the truth's not getting out. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they feel like, well, somebody else is getting credit for what I just did, and I should do it. And other times they just sort of enjoy being at the center of the action. But, we don't pay, so there's no money, there's no financial gain. And we check them out as best we can, but it's from my experience, especially dealing in law enforcement, it's primarily people who feel the public has a right to know what's being kept from them.
Absolutely. A few more things, because I don't want to keep you too long, and I've had a lot of time. I've had a great time chatting with you. It's
been really fantastic. Your wealth of knowledge is very impressive.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that, hearing it from you. So, reporting on Bernie Madoff, but also reporting on nuclear smuggling, two very different stories, but two very important stories. We'll touch on nuclear smuggling first. For those that may not remember, what was going on here and what did you dig up?
1 year after the 2001 attacks, there remained concern that Al-Qaeda would try to smuggle in a dirty bomb and explode it in a major city, New York or somewhere else. And that would essentially, a radioactive device exploded in New York. It might just close down the city, frankly. It was great concern. And they actually, at one point, had a tip it was coming. It wasn't the case. But we decided to test the system. They had developed this brand new fancy machine. They had it at Port Elizabeth over in New Jersey. And every container coming off the big ships would be put through this machine. And they told President Bush, who got a tour of it, we can spot any of these devices, we can spot radioactivity. So to test that, our little fiendish minds decided we would get a 14.99 ounces of depleted uranium, which would have the same sort of signature as the real stuff. And we would essentially bring it in the United States. So Rhonda Schwartz, a longtime producer, and I went to Turkey. We picked up this little container of depleted uranium in, I guess it was Austria, took it by train to Turkey. And there we rented a huge container. And we learned that for a little extra price, they'll bring the container to wherever you want. So we had them bring it to this street in the middle of nowhere in Istanbul. And we loaded up the container with huge ox carts and large terracotta vases, 5-6 feet high, plus a little suitcase that had this depleted uranium. We put it inside a Turkish sort of a pearl embedded chest, which I still actually have in my den here where I'm speaking from. Put it in the container, had the people from the shipping company lock it up, seal it, put it on a ship, off to New York it went. It got to New York. It was put through the big fancy, George Bush seal of approval machine, and they did not detect it. We then had our containers trucked from Port Elizabeth, New Jersey, across the Verrazano into Brooklyn to Pier 1, right across from downtown Wall Street, and opened and broke the seal there, and there it was. And so it was a bit of a stunt, but it did prove the point that all these promises of this money they were spending and these assurances that could never happen, it could have happened. And that's what we did. It infuriated the Bush administration. They banned producer Rhonda Schwartz from federal buildings for a few days, threatened her with arrest. And it was a powerful demonstration that we couldn't necessarily believe what they were telling us about security arrangements.
I remember a while ago somebody asking the question, why does the NYPD have its own counterterrorism bureau? Have the federal government do that? The Counterterrorism Bureau, for those of you that do not know, is perhaps the most expansive of any police department locally in the world, not just the country, but the world. Ray Kelly and David Cohen, formerly the CIA, built it up from scratch. And what their counterterrorism program is just as good as any federal agency. And why is that? Well, because of this. That answers the question. What they cannot do for you federally, well, you know what? We might as well do it ourselves, because if they fail, we're all we got. And
right.
There's an instance
and a feeling that the feds wouldn't necessarily level.
Right.
They got to know on their own.
And Bush, what did he run on in 2004? Security. Who can keep you safe? Well, that's not, that's not something that was going to help his campaign slogan. Of course, 2 years out from running for re-election, when the first question was, well, how could you let this happen in the first place? So, but then again, we need to know if there's an adequate system in place that can keep us safe. And we're very vulnerable. Even now, even after that day, they're not going to stop. But what's in place to keep us safe, is it foolproof? Well, a story like that in that instance proved not so much, which in 2002, given the PTSD everybody had from the previous year, had to send shivers down their spine, including yours, having been in New York for the attack.
It did. And, people said, why would you do that? Why would you tell the bad guys how to do it? Well, in fact, we essentially replicated what Al-Qaeda had tried to do, putting bombs into sesame seeds being shipped to New York. And I always say to them, I wish to heck I had done an investigation about weak airport security in early 2001, because that might get the attention of the bureaucrats.
There you go. And Bernie Madoff, now to pivot over to a different case. Here is someone, I've grown up a diehard Yankee fan, and the joke used to be about the Mets up until recently. The reason why the Mets would never spend money is because Bernie Madoff, he gypped the Wilpons, and he did. Here was someone that played Wall Street like a fiddle. And 2008 is an interesting time because you're covering him and you're writing your first book. So when it comes to unearthing this lie, this myth, this fraud who just recently passed away and left so much damage in his wake, the most heartbreaking one of them all being one of his sons who committed suicide as a result of all this. When did you first hear the inklings about, this sham of a human being?
I first heard it. I was at Elaine's. They now closed, but well-known New York City bar where I was first brought by John Miller, and it was a hangout for cops and reporters. And
he used to be there with Bill Bratton all the time.
Yeah, Bill Bratton. And I was there with Rich Esposito, who's now at the NYPD, but at the time was my colleague at ABC News. And we had just finished covering the story of the Illinois governor who had been arrested on charges of bribery. And we're sort of having like kind of like end of mission drink there. And Esposito said, I just got a call from someone that said they've arrested somebody on Wall Street by the name of Bernie Madoff. And it involves billions of dollars. And of course, knowing everything, I said, it can't be billions of dollars. That'd be the biggest thing ever. That can't be billions. It must be millions. I think you must have misheard it. Said, no, I heard it was billions. I said, well, I don't know about that. I called the people at Good Morning America. No interest whatsoever. Nah, we haven't heard of this guy. Nobody at Elaine's had really heard much about him. Of course, we then learned a lot about him and how he was sort of a little bit under the radar, but very, very well insulated in the financial world and was able to pull off this scam. And kind of the big breakthrough for us was when producer Rhonda Schwartz and some others were able to locate his secretary, Eleanor, who felt so betrayed by Bernie Madoff. She was so loyal to him. But when he was arrested, she was taking all the calls from people saying, this can't be true. Tell us it's not true. We're ruined. Our lives are over. And she was so betrayed that she came to ABC, and essentially we gave her a desk and she set up shop and helped us learn all about Madoff, the ins and the outs. We got his little black book. We got all the information about what he was doing, all his schemes. And it was invaluable. And that led to a series of great reports. The book that I wrote, The Madoff Chronicles, which was then used to make a movie starring Richard Dreyfuss.
My goodness. And here was somebody that profited during an odd time, in that the 90s represented a very, very strong economy. There's ebbs and there's flows to it. And the 90s was a glorious time for it, but this was not that. After 9/11, the economy dipped. Wartime economy is always a very, very turmoil period, no matter the country, no matter the resources. And yet, even in this time of great financial strife, he literally made off like a bandit.
He got through the 2001 downturn. He was shameless. His longtime secretary, in fact, when her father died in a plane or a traffic accident, I think it was, she inherited his money and asked Bernie, what should I do with it? He said, just give it to me. I'll invest it for you. Well, the fact was he never bought a single share of stock in his life. He would meet with his sort of henchmen at the end of the month. They go through the papers and they would look at all the stocks. They'd pick the ones that had risen high. So they'd remark as if they'd bought them low and sold them high, and vice versa. And it was like betting on a racehorse after the race was over. He was foolproof. And that's what he did day in, day out. When the SEC would come to investigate, they sent these sort of rookie auditors in there. They literally would be down on the floor beneath the main floor, printing out reams and reams and reams of false returns. And they'd come out of the printer so hot, they couldn't give them to the auditors because they were too warm. They'd put them in the refrigerator. They'd throw them around. They'd try to keep them cold. So, as you print something, it's hot. And he got away with this for so many years till finally the downturn in 2008 of the economy. And everybody was withdrawing their money and he just couldn't make it. And he thought he had conned his sons into giving him 24 hours to do something. I think he was to flee the country. They went right to the FBI and the SEC, and he was arrested the next morning. But that night, after he told his sons all the scams, he held the staff Christmas party at Rosa Mexicana.
My God. Yeah, he was shameless. He didn't care at all. He didn't care at all. And again,
he's got a sociopath mind.
Yeah, and it's the destruction he left in his wake, as I mentioned earlier. It's a tragic part because when one of his other sons passed away from cancer, but one of his sons, as I mentioned, hung himself, committed suicide as a result of this. And what was disturbing to read is after he hung himself, in the next room, unaware of all this, thankfully, was a 2-year-old boy.
You're right. You are absolutely right. And it was what a tragedy all around for this man who was, and he lived quite the life. It wasn't as high flying as you might have thought, but it was pretty high flying. And I recall when he was in court and he was being sentenced after entering a guilty plea, and he turned for about a half second to address all the people there who had come to testify about how their lives had been ruined. He turned and said, to my victims, I say, I'm sorry. That was it. That was the extent of his remorse.
Not at all.
Yeah.
I'm not making light of it, but there's a funny scene in The Office where Dwight Schrute's character steps in and he reads from the note, "I state my regret." And he puts the note back in his pocket. It's like, and then,
Yeah,
Jim
exactly right.
says,
Exactly.
Jim says to him, "You couldn't memorize that?" He's like, "I could not because I did not feel it." So that's Madoff in a nutshell. Not to make light of his crimes. Lieutenant Pranzo, Peter Pranzo, who has a book out of his own, Harlem Raiders. He wants to know: do you have a new book out? Because he would love to read about a collection of your stories.
I do not. I'm working on a couple of things, and thanks so much, Peter. But the Madoff book was my first. I wrote it. It made the New York Times bestseller list just briefly, but it did make it, and I was very, very proud of it. It was, as always, just like in the police or anywhere, TV is a very collaborative business, and there's so many people I've worked with over the years who, didn't get the credit or the salary I did because I was the guy on the air, but are just absolutely, real troopers throughout. And I'm forever thankful for the great teams I worked with, from Waterloo to NBC to ABC, now at the Law and Crime Network.
One more note before I get to the concluding segment. Let's talk about the Law and Crime Network. Same thing kind of earlier when I asked you about leaving NBC for ABC. ABC for a long time now, you pretty much, I imagine, had carte blanche to do the stories that you wanted to do. But you talked earlier about a challenge and wanting a challenge, and hence why you left 30 Rock for ABC. Was that in the same vein that you left ABC for Law and Crime, wanting a new challenge?
Well, I found a new challenge. I didn't really leave ABC the way I thought I would leave ABC, but I did find the Law and Crime Network, and Dan Abrams, who runs it, asked me to come and join him. And it's just been a terrific new challenge. And unlike, it's a startup. So unlike the big guys like NBC and ABC, it's a challenge. So we work on a smaller budget, and we've got to be more creative and a little more flexible and agile, and be able, that's our strength and our weakness too. We don't have the big guns, but we can move faster and move smarter in many ways. So I'm enjoying it greatly. There's a weekly show on the network. We're producing a documentary with HBO on a story we've been covering. And we're now in the third season of a special thing we do on A&E called Killer Cases. We look at some of the trials that Law and Crime has covered, and then sort of do the backstory about the investigations that the police made to make the cases come to real life.
It's right in my alley. I'll have to find it. I have YouTube TV now, so hopefully you guys are up on YouTube TV, right?
I think so. Yes, we are. And I encourage you. And Mike, it's been really fantastic talking to you. Really.
Oh, thank you. It's been likewise. The pleasure's been all mine. It's been great to have you. Been watching you for years. So now, in that vein, it is time for the concluding segment of this podcast. It is called Rapid Fire and consists of 5 hit and run questions from me, 5 answers from you. So instead of asking you, "Are you ready?" I'll ask you what the late great Peter Jennings did. Sniper in place. Sniper in place. So first, the funniest story you ever covered.
Well, funniest story I ever covered. It's hard to say that any of them have really been funny. The strangest one maybe was when we got a tip that the FBI was investigating NASA, and that one of the astronauts, Michael Wolff, was going to be implicated in taking bribes to help push certain projects through. So we went down to Houston. The FBI had its big raid, and I went to see Michael Wolff thinking, this guy is in trouble, and got to know him and learned that, in fact, the whole FBI scheme against him had its serious questions. And so to sort of cement the deal, he said, "You want to go flying?" I did not realize he was a stunt pilot. All these NASA astronauts are stunt pilots. They all have their little, twin engine, twin wing, bi-wing planes. And he took me up, and I know what he was trying to do, because loop after loop after loop, I was green. I couldn't eat. And he said, "You're the first guy I took up who hasn't thrown up." So, it was great meeting him. And it was, to me, is also a reminder that, go into a story, don't have your sort of thoughts so well armed, you know exactly what the story is. It had to be flexible. And I changed my mind completely about what the story was going to be. It wasn't going to be about Michael Wolff, the crook. It'd be Michael Wolff, kind of the victim of an FBI sting.
That's interesting. I'll have to go and find that story through the archives that exist on YouTube, and YouTube is one gigantic archive. Second, favorite, well, besides Michael Wolff, who was great in his own right, favorite interview you've ever done?
I was thinking about that because I was a rapid fire, but you gave me a tip off. It may have been an interview when I was a reporter in Cleveland, and I was sent to interview the great composer Aaron Copland,
Hmm.
who probably I mean one of America's greatest composers, and it was so fascinating to hear him talk about how he did his job and how he found his creativity and how you have to strive always to be your best no matter what was going on. And I think looking back at all the interviews I've done, because a lot of them are confrontational, going after the bad guys. And this was one where it just, the power of his words was so much and I so admired what he had to say. So I've always thought of that. And that was probably back at 1975 that I did that. Probably my favorite.
I don't blame you. Third, interview you wish you could have done.
Well, I wish I could have interviewed Bishop Ratzinger, who went on to become Pope Benedict. I was doing an investigation into the Vatican's failure to go after allegations of sexual abuse by key top-rated sort of Catholic officials. And we waited for him outside his residence in the Vatican City, and he came out. I introduced myself to him, and when I told him what I wanted to ask him about, he slapped me. Slapped my hand. You do not ask such questions. And I wish I'd had the interview. I thought maybe I should have played it differently. And then a year and a half later, he's the Pope.
My God.
I was bitched by the Pope.
There's a story.
Yeah.
If you ever want to use that at the bar, you slide over. Let me tell you about the time.
Yeah.
Fourth, favorite bar or restaurant in New York City?
I would probably say Sandro's, Upper East Side, 81st Street and 2nd Avenue, a little Italian place off to the side there with this great big, larger than life chef who walks around, looks like he's in his pajamas. Great food. You're like in Rome. That I've got a number of them, but that's certainly one of them.
There are a few places that Elaine's is not around anymore. Elaine Coffin passed away in 2010, 2011. But there are a few places if I could be a fly on the wall for, I'd love to go back in time and sit at a table at Elaine's with Bill Bratton, Jack Maple, and John Miller. Because boy.
Yeah, I was so privileged to have been there at that time, and to sort of be like I don't know, I was John's deputy or something. He owned the place.
He did.
I was just a visitor.
Fifth and finally, knowing what you know now, if you can go back in time and get advice to a younger version of yourself, what would you tell a young Brian Ross?
Work hard, show up early. Not everybody does that.
True.
And be prepared. Like you are, Mike. You really, go into it. Don't go in and try to wing it.
No, never. I couldn't. I don't want to fly without a safety net. Yeah. So exactly. The preparation is the safety net. Well, Brian, I thank you so much. Stick around. We'll say our goodbyes off the air. But before we go, is there any shout outs that you want to give to anyone or anything?
I want to give a shout out to all the people I've worked with over the years, as I said, who have been such important parts of my career. Great journalists who don't always get the attention they deserve, but they're there and they go into work every day just trying to find the truth.
Absolutely. My shout out again, as always, to the audience, a live chat. I'll go through it one more time. Ruth Ann Griffin, Michelina Sereno, Margaret Hearn, Peter Pranzo, Raquel Pranzo, his better half, of course. We have, of course, Alicia B at the top, retired NYPD Detective Scott Wagner, who will tell you, as he tells me here, was at those tables with Miller and Maple. He was one of Miller's security guys, so you probably bumped past with him or crossed paths with him at some point in the mid-90s. Thanks, guys, as always. D-Truth as well. For being here and supporting this show. Coming up on the Mike to New Haven podcast tomorrow, live at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. He was an original member of the Urban Search and Rescue Task Force and was a member of the FDNY Rescue 4 for 18 of his 25 years. Responded to everything you can think of as one of the best technical rescue firemen this city has ever had. Highly decorated. His name is Mike Milner, and he'll join me for Volume 9 of the Best of the Bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite. Great shows on tap for 2022. In the meantime, I thank you as always, everyone, for tuning in. I'll see you again tomorrow night. And on behalf of Brian Ross, I am Mike Colón, and we will see you next time.